Hello everyone, my name is Parsai. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. I teach immigration consulting at Ashton College. I'm also the author of the bestseller book in Canada called 88 Tips on Immigration to Canada, which is available on Amazon websites. Today I would like to talk about a very much anticipated topic, working in Canada, because we receive so many messages on Facebook, Instagram, phone calls, emails, you name it, that people are looking for work opportunities or job opportunities in Canada and if they can work in Canada. Before I proceed, I need to talk about one specific designation, and that designation is what's the difference between temporary stay in Canada and permanent stay in Canada. When you apply for immigration to Canada, you become a permanent resident of Canada if you are approved. And upon becoming a permanent resident of Canada, you may stay for as long as you want in Canada, work anywhere in Canada, and live anywhere in Canada. This is protected by the Charter of Rights, by Immigration Refugee Protection Act, and many other laws and regulations. But when you are working in Canada, your stay is temporary. You need to designate between these two. That means that by the end of your work permit, you have to leave Canada. The same situation is for somebody who is here as a visitor or somebody who is here on a study permit. So we need to know that first. The second issue is that when you're applying for a work permit to Canada, you need to be familiar with national occupational classifications. So the government of Canada has divided different works or different job titles into 500 different classifications. And each classification defines a group of jobs that exist in Canada. So presumably, no matter what kind of work you have in Canada, you could fit yourself into one of these subcategories or classifications. These kinds of classifications are called National Occupational Classification, or NOC, or NOC. NOC is also divided into different levels. It's good to know the codes associated with any of those levels. So we have NOC 0, which refers to managerial jobs. So whether you are the manager of a coffee shop or you're the manager of Walmart in Canada, your job falls under NOC 0. The other group is NOC A. These are the kind of jobs that you usually need a university degree, so whether it's a bachelor's degree or master's degree or PhD, that you need to do those jobs. I say usually because sometimes you may do a NOC A job, but you are not necessarily a university graduate. The third group would be NOC B jobs, which basically are those kind of jobs that you usually need to go to a college and get a college certificate or diploma or associate degree or post-secondary diploma. The third group is NOC C jobs, or actually the fourth group is the NOC C jobs, and those NOC C jobs are the jobs that normally you hold a high school diploma and you have received some level of training, on job training or outside job training, to be able to do those jobs. And the last group, which is NOC D, are laborer jobs. And for laborer jobs, although sometimes you need to receive some sort of training, they do not necessarily need a high school diploma or a college degree. Okay. The other issue that we need to talk about is called labor market impact assessment. So imagine you are a foreign national and you come to Canada to work. Now what you are doing, you are potentially taking away a position from a Canadian or permanent resident of Canada. Do you remember I told you that if you are a permanent resident of Canada, you have the right to live anywhere in Canada or work anywhere in Canada? Imagine that you refer to an employer and that employer refuses to hire you as a permanent resident of Canada because they have hired a foreign national. Obviously, Canadians do not like that, and there are many political tensions around hiring foreign nationals. That's why the government of Canada has asked an organization called ESDC, or Employment and Social Development Canada, which the face of it is called Service Canada, to review every employer's request to hire somebody from outside Canada. So they ask many documents like advertisements on or as they call it, recruitment efforts, business legitimacy documents, etc., to see if that need really exists to hire somebody from outside Canada, or if this employer hires somebody from outside Canada, it won't affect the Canadian job market in a negative way. If they approve that case, they issue something called a positive LMIA, which shows that your job does not affect the job market in Canada negatively, and then you may apply for a work permit. Holding on to a positive LMIA is not a guarantee for work permit, but it paves the way for submitting an application for a work permit. But honestly, sometimes you don't even need an LMIA, or you don't even need a work permit to work in Canada. If you refer to Section 186 of the immigration regulations, there are many subcategories of jobs that they are exempt even from a work permit. That means if you are coming from, for example, the United States, you're a US citizen, then you don't need anything. You just travel to Canada with your passport and you start working. If you are from a visa-exempt country like the United Kingdom, or from Germany or Italy or Japan, all you need to do is to apply for an ETA, or electronic travel authorization, and come to Canada and work. If you are from a visa-required country, then you need to apply for a temporary resident visa, and then with that visa you can come to Canada and work. This is fantastic. But the reality is that those kind of jobs are usually temporary. Their source of funding is from outside Canada, etc. Again, I say usually because it depends on the case. I give you some examples. So one example is a group of performing artists, so dancers, opera singers, etc., that they want to come to Canada to perform. If the performance is for a limited period of time, then those people do not need a work permit and they can work in Canada. Another example would be a group of athletes that they want to come to Canada to compete in a contest or in a competition or in a game, and then they will go back home. Or a group of referees that they come to Canada for the purpose of taking care of, for example, some competition here in Canada, which is an amateur group of competitions. And the other group would be a speaker, a professional speaker, a motivational speaker that comes to Canada to speak, and they are compensated, but the duration of their speech or the duration of the program that they are part of that is less than 5 days. These are some examples. Or a crew, a flight crew that they come to Canada, but they are going to work for their own airline. And business visitors, of course, which falls under Section 187 and 186 of the regulations. So that's one group. And obviously, if somebody approaches me and they say, I'm coming here to work in Canada, the first thing first is that we look into the nature of their work. And if we realize that that work is exempt from a work permit, that's the direction we're going to take, and we won't apply for a work permit. But if they need a work permit, the second question for us is that, do we really need LMIA? Because going through the process of LMIA is time-consuming, expensive, and prone to be refused. That's why if we can find some exemption, then we won't apply for LMIA. Those exemptions fall under something called International Mobility Program, which are defined under Section 204 to 208 of the regulations. So we look into those, and if we find an exemption code, that's where we are going. We will apply for that work permit under an IMP exemption code or LMIA exemption code. In fact, about 2/3 of people who work in Canada, they work without an LMIA. They just are exempted from LMIA under different codes based on the agreements that Canada has with different countries, based on Canadian interests, based on humanitarian reasons, which defining them is out of the scope of this topic here. But if you need LMIA, then we have no choice but to apply for an LMIA first. And of course, applying for LMIA is more than anything to clear or pave the way for the employer to hire somebody from outside Canada. Okay, having said that, what does that mean in terms of work permit? So to apply for work permit, you need to go through 3 steps. Step number 1, you need a job offer. Of course, there are some exceptions that we could apply for an open work permit, which I will explain later on. But generally speaking, if you want to work in Canada, first you need to receive a job offer from a Canadian employer. Sometimes this happens to us that somebody calls me and say, oh, I can be a live-in caregiver, for example, and do you have any opportunities for me? And my question, the first question that I ask is, do you have a job offer? Do you have an employer who is willing to hire you? And if the answer is no, then I would say, I'm sorry, we cannot do anything without having an actual employer. This happens all the time on our Facebook page, especially, that somebody says, I need work. Okay, but that means the relationship between you and an employer in Canada, that they are willing to hire you. So that's step number 1, that you need a job offer. Step number 2 is that if the work is not exempt from a work permit, then we need to see if it's exempt from LMIA, or we need to apply for an LMIA. So that's when we resolve that and we have either the LMIA or exemption from LMIA, then the third step comes, which is application for a work permit. We apply for a work permit, and if the application is approved, then the client or my client can come to Canada and start working. Now, where can we apply for a work permit? By default, under Section 197 of the regulations, every single person can apply from outside Canada. So before entering Canada, you may apply for work permit, assuming that you have a job offer, you have gone through the LMIA process, etc. You can submit your application. Most people submit their applications online, because nowadays work permit applications by default are online applications. But you may also refer to a visa application center and pass all your documents on paper to that visa application center and wait for them to pass it on to the immigration authorities to review your application. The second group are those people who can apply at a port of entry, and by default these are people under Section 198. These are people who are exempt from visit visas to Canada. So for any reason, if you are exempt from a visitor's visa to Canada, you may take your package to a port of entry like Pearson Airport in Toronto, or the airport in Montreal, or maybe one of the land crossings between the United States and Canada, and then present your documents to the border services officers. They will review your application, and if they are happy with the application, they will issue the work permit for you on the spot. The third group of people, which is a limited number of people, are people who are permitted to apply from inside Canada. So after entering Canada, they may apply for a work permit, which falls under Section 199 of the regulations. Keep that in mind, that not everybody can do that. So it's not that you can just travel to Canada and find an employer, and if they offer you a job, then you can submit your application for work permit. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that for many people. There are some exceptions, of course. For example, if you are a visitor to Canada and your spouse or common law partner is here on a study permit or a work permit, in that situation, you may apply from inside Canada. Or for example, if you are a refugee claimant and waiting for a decision or your hearing, in that situation, you may apply for a work permit from inside Canada. There are some other exceptional situations, but generally speaking, applying after entering Canada is not an option for most people. And you need to know that the government of Canada has enhanced their system, and recently, based on the collaboration with CBSA or Border Services Agency and other entities, they know for most part who is actually inside Canada, who is outside Canada. So it's a very dangerous game. If you are inside Canada and you do not qualify for application from inside Canada, you apply from inside Canada. In fact, I have seen this over and over, that sometimes even my colleagues make this mistake and submit an application from inside Canada, which unfortunately gets refused. So you have to be very careful whether you can apply at a port of entry or you can apply from outside Canada or inside Canada. I also suggest that you watch my short video about flag polling, which explains to you that under what some exceptional circumstances you may apply at a port of entry, which normally you can't. Okay. The big one, when you want to work in Canada, you need a job offer. And the first thing that could cross your mind is a job board or a job search websites like Indeed.ca, Monster.ca, Workopolis.com, and many others. In fact, if you refer to our website, Settler.ca, I have an article that I have published all my, not all, but many of the websites that they offer jobs, and they post different job opportunities. Some of them are government funded, some of them are not government funded. I have tried to be as comprehensive as possible. So that's one option. To be honest with you, the chances that a Canadian employer decides to hire somebody from outside Canada is close to 0%, because they need to go, they know that they need to go through the LMIA process and work permit application, and etc., and it takes time and money and energy, and they usually are not interested in that unless they are desperate to find somebody from outside Canada. So your chances are very slim, but give it a try. You might be able to find a job in Canada through job search website. The other option that you may consider is the option of something that we call it cold calling. Cold calling means either you will actually pick up the phone and call Canadian employers, or you travel to Canada, hold on to your resume, and you knock on the door of different offices and just present your resume to them and hope for the best. Because sometimes when the employer sees you in person and they find that they really want to hire you because of your qualifications, they may go to extremes. They may go through the LMIA process, the hiring a professional, etc., to hire you. So, of course, obviously for this reason, you need to apply for a visit visa or ETA depending on your nationality and come to Canada and actually spend money traveling to Canada and spend a few days here in Canada, or maybe a few weeks, to meet different employers. Typically, about 20% of the jobs are based on cold calling. And that opens some doors. In fact, we have hired some of our employees that they decided to do cold calling. They came to our office and they presented their resume to us, and they went through the interview process, and we liked them and we hired them. So it's a possibility. It's not a very huge opportunity, but it exists, especially if you have the financial means and a visa or necessary documents to enter Canada and apply for cold calling. The third group would be recruitment agencies. You need to keep in mind that no recruitment agency, no person, no organization, no employer in Canada is permitted to charge you money for hiring you. This is illegal, okay? So they cannot ask you to pay them money because they want to hire you or they want to find you jobs. This is not ethical, this is not legal, and you have to be very careful with those claims that they tell you that pay us such and such amount of money and we will find you jobs. Unfortunately, there are many abuses because of that in the system, and that's why the law is very sensitive towards this matter. They don't want exploitation of foreign workers. But if you find an ethical recruitment agency and they accept your case, then they will do the legwork on your behalf and they find a job for you. Of course, they will be eventually compensated by the employer, so they are not worried about being compensated. It's just that they do not charge you. Okay? The next issue is medical examination. So do you need to do medical examination? So generally speaking, the officers do not request medical examination from a person who applies for a work permit, generally speaking. But keep that in mind. Every now and again, of course, at the discretion of the officer may request that. Or if something adverse is going on, a calamity is going on, like what right now that we are recording this, we are dealing with coronavirus. Or for example, in the past we had the issue of Ebola. In those situations, the officers are more vigilant in terms of accepting work permit applications, and they may constantly request medical examination from everybody. And the other issue is that if you are going to work with children, or if you are going to work in healthcare environment, in those situations, you definitely need a medical examination. And what you need to do before submitting your work permit application, you go to a panel physician who is a physician approved by immigration refugee authorities, and you need to ask for an upfront medical examination. So you tell them, I need an upfront medical examination because I'm going to apply for work permit. So they will do that, and you will include that report in your application, and the officers will lift need for going through medical examination from you, and they allow you to work, for example, with children or in healthcare environment. Obviously, if your work permit is related to that. Another issue is open work permit. So generally speaking, when you apply for a work permit, your work permit is limited to a single employer. And interestingly enough, you may be even limited geographically or to a specific branch of that employer. So if, for example, if Tim Hortons hires you, it doesn't mean that you can work for any Tim Hortons. You usually can work only for one branch of Tim Hortons in a specific city. So these limitations exist with majority of work permits. But some of the work permits are open. For example, if you are the spouse of a worker in Canada and the government issues you a work permit, you usually receive an open work permit. If you receive an open work permit, it means that you are allowed to work for any employer in Canada. Sometimes they impose limitations on open work permits, but many times they are quite open. So you can, it's probably the closest thing that you could get to the permanent residency of Canada. If you receive an open work permit, good for you. You can probably work for any employer that who is willing to hire you. Two more issues and we're done. One of them is about working while studying. If you are an international student, but you are studying at a post-secondary level, so at college or university, and you are working, you are studying full-time, you hold a valid study permit. In those situations, you are allowed to work up to 20 hours per week for any employer. So it's like an open work permit, but limited number of hours per week. During the days that the college is off, like summertime or wintertime, then you may work full-time. So that's a great opportunity for students because they can work in Canada while studying in Canada. And that paves the way for them to have some Canadian experience and eventually get hired by an employer in Canada. And that brings us to the last topic of the day, which permanent residency. So if you work in Canada for a while, depending on your NOC code and depending on which province you're working at, then you could potentially immigrate to Canada. So sometimes you qualify for express entry, sometimes you qualify for provincial nominee program, And what you need to do is just to review different options on their website or ask a professional, and they will tell you about potential opportunities that exist for you to become permanent resident of Canada. Normally, those options open to you if you work in Canada for at least 1 year. But if you work in Canada, then you may consider becoming a permanent resident of Canada and eventually, hopefully, become a Canadian citizen. And that wraps up our discussion today. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to watch our other videos about immigration to Canada, and of course, subscribe to our channel.